Chicago and training manager with Keshet, a national organization working for LGBTQ belonging in Jewish life.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be with you. So we welcome all questions in the chat this afternoon. And as a gentle note, we want to invite folks to consider if you yourself would be comfortable answering what you're asking before sending in the chat box. We're looking forward to an open conversation and sharing our responses and expertise on some of the topics addressed in the film. We also want to invite folks to ask questions in language you currently have, and to be open to kind of receiving any gentle correction if there's a more updated term available for use and our communities.
We are so glad to have you all here virtually with us. Once again, my name is Rena Rosen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white cisgender woman wearing a white top. I have brown hair, which is pulled back, and I'm wearing brown glasses. I'm sitting in my office, and as the inclusion coordinator, I've been committed to creating more access to foster a rich culture of belonging in all areas of our organization and community. Jackie, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself a bit and give us a brief synopsis of the work that Keshet does.
Thanks, Rena. Hi, everyone. So my pronouns are she and her, and I'm a white, queer, cisgender South African woman. I'm wearing a black shirt with some kind of puffy sleeves. I have dark brown hair cut in a short wavy bob. My background is white with the Keshet logo and a rainbow in Keshet's colors across the top in a thin band. I also want to just let you know that I have a foster cat in the room with me. So if you see a small ginger blur, that's Stan the cat, and I'll do my best to minimize him as a distraction. So a little bit about Keshet. We're a national organization that works for the full equality of LGBTQ Jews and our families in Jewish life. Keshet was founded in 1996 in Boston as a volunteer-led organization, but we're now a national organization with offices in Boston and New York, here in Chicago and San Francisco, and a number of fellow staff members are based across the country. So we have three main areas of work. The first is institutional work through teaching and learning. So we equip Jewish organizations with skills and knowledge to build LGBTQ affirming communities. Next is that we have youth programs. So we create spaces in which all queer Jewish youth feel seen and valued. And third, we advance LGBTQ rights nationwide. We also have a number of resources along the themes of this film and beyond. So folks are welcome to check them out after this conversation. Feel free to visit our website, keshetonline.org, to find our resource library.
Great, thank you, Jackie. So I wanted to note that the reason why we explain what we're wearing and where we are is for people who are visually impaired or blind, or for people who are listening on their phone. And we share our pronouns to ensure that this is a safe space for everyone who is watching and part of our community. So before we begin our discussion relating to the film, we want to share a disclaimer that the dialogue between us will be our current knowledge and experience as cisgender women, and we do not pretend to speak for transgender folk. We hope to give you a full intentional reflection while naming that there are multiple other voices that need to be heard. We invite you to consider this as an invitation to further conversation and learning. From the very beginning of the film, there are some beautiful, poignant moments captured. The delivery of the beautiful earrings from Amit's daughter, the way in which Galit supports Amit in this moment of great anticipation and anxiety right before she goes downstairs to her friends for her birthday while wearing the dress, to the moment when Galit is sitting on the couch describing the first time that Amit disclosed to her the true feelings of wanting to be her authentic self. Galit during this time made a decision to do whatever she could without breaking up the family. That was her boundary for loving Amit. She would love until she reached a point where she could take it no more. These are the exact words from Galit. It's interesting to witness the multidimensionality of both Amit and Galit's experiences in this moment. The conversation that the two of them had about Amit's decision to bring a rainbow fan to the kids' school as an example. And I think of Galit in the supportive role and Amit and her transition, and this appearing to be a discomfort for her.
I also want to spotlight one of the experiences with Amit and Galit's business partner, because this is kind of a key experience in the film, and it happens towards the beginning. So Amit is really nervous to share her truth with Yaakov in fear that he'll no longer want to work with them. And luckily, the response in the film is nothing like that. He's so welcoming of her and her story and still wants to work with their business. But in truth, many LGBTQ people experience job discrimination and economic marginalization because of other people's transphobia and homophobia. So it's understandable that Amit and Galit were nervous about sharing information of Amit's identity with one of their clients.
So something that really struck me also was that Amit and Galit's daughter talked about that, Amit and Galit's daughter was talking about how she built a wall around herself, which she mentions in the film to her friend. She does this almost to protect herself and her family from any toxicity of others. The daughter emphasizes that with Amit, that she loves her and appears to want what's best for her. At the same time, she mentions the struggle she faces due to other people's harmful opinions about her family. Learning how to balance the outside world and the reactions of others have towards her family, while grappling with her own understanding, is complex, and the love she has is beautiful. The complexity begins in adults, and we see that children are accepting and open and honest about their feelings, discomfort, and love. So, what happens in adulthood that shifts? There's a systematic shift that needs to happen. One of the children, Yardane's friends, wrote to Amit that because of her parents' concern, they would no longer be allowing them to come over. The way in which Amit reframed the conversation to say, don't argue with your parents over this, we love you, and that sexuality, sexual proclivity, and gender are innate, not acquired. Nobody decides to change his gender because he talks to someone who has, and it's not a contagious disease. Amit goes on to say, I guess your parents just don't understand and they're just trying to protect you. And Yardane's response is, everyone has their own way of raising kids. And I thought this was very interesting, just the conversation they had about, Yardane's way of understanding that their family is unique and it's beautiful and it's nothing to be afraid of, or, you can't catch transgender, it's not something that you should be afraid of. And the way that Amit and explained that and brought so much love to it was really powerful.
I think that part of the film is so challenging to hear because it really speaks to a misunderstanding of identities, and so often misunderstanding leads to fear. And I want to just kind of clarify one background piece, which is that a person's gender identity is real as soon as they experience it, and there's nothing that a person has to do in order for gender identity to be real. So some trans folks choose to transition, which means living in a different gender than they did before, and that may or may not include changes to names or using new pronouns or changing appearance and wearing different clothing and changing your hairstyle or undergoing any medical components that you can choose or access. We see a selection of these choices happening in the film, but there is no one universal recipe for transition. And there's no point at which a transition is complete or becomes real. The person's gender, who we know ourselves to be, is real as soon as we know it.
And I think that, when thinking about the human experience, there's so much to being a human. And, we're complex, we're deep, we're emotionally charged. There's just so much to being a human being. And if something isn't aligned with who we are, we kind of fall apart. And we begin to see that in the progression of the film. And it proves more challenging on the marriage and relationship of Amit and Galit. And if we focus on one part of the human experience, we, either whether it's the highs or the lows, we miss out on the complete story. And this film really does a beautiful job of showcasing, the painful moments, the beautiful moments. And we want to be clear that the LGBTQ experience can involve pain at having to navigate oppressive systems. There's also great joy to be found in queer and trans community. And yeah. We just want to note that gender euphoria is a term used to describe the experience of stepping into one's self in an authentic way. And the surgery that takes place in Thailand puts a heavy weight on the family and a strain on the relationship between Galit and Amit. We can see how much they care for one another, and yet there's something that really is challenging there. And, you know, when Amit and Galit, they rekindle their marriage, Galit says something interesting. She says, or Amit says, may we all break some masks in our lives. And they don't use a traditional cup to break, but a mask, and how appropriate that they're both redefining the identity in their own place. Obviously, in the film, you can see their marriage didn't last in the end. Amit had to give Galit a get, which is a Jewish law, as in a legal divorce decree performed by the Beit Din, where a man must relinquish a woman from a marriage. And this is really interesting because in this case, Amit had to use a pronoun that she did not identify with anymore. This is something to reflect on. How do we restructure and redesign a ritual that's currently harmful to some, and to be more inclusive and dignified? You know, the story of Amit and Galit does not end with a happily ever after, or does it? The two women find their true authentic paths, and they went through incredible adversity to get to that point together. They both found love. Their children knew their parents to be full, complex humans, to have a clear understanding of finding a queer community. And that's a beautiful thing. So I see a couple of questions that popped up. Jackie, would you like to address the questions?
Sure. So I'll read the first one so I can respond to it. It says, do you find that transgender people are being accepted more now since there is so much more information? And I think, yes, there certainly is more visibility and representation of trans folks. And when folks become more visible, that means that more people can see others like themselves and step into themselves. It gives other people permission to step into themselves. And that comes with a response of backlash. So we see, yes, many more people are able to say who they are and step into themselves, their true selves. And we're seeing a lot of backlash. For example, the number of bathroom bills that are being raised in a number of states in this country is the backlash because of transgender visibility. Well, not because of the visibility itself, but because of transphobia. And we also know that 2021 was one of the deadliest years in history for Black trans women specifically. People who own themselves and feel, yes, this is who I am, unfortunately are met with a great deal of violence and backlash.
Susie, I thought both parents supported their children well throughout. It appears they did. I definitely think that, and Jackie, chime in or cut me off if I'm going a different direction, but I think that from Amit's perspective, she can only speak to her experience and her relationship with her kids and the way she is accepted and received in the world, and the same thing for Galit. And so I think that they both were supported by their children, but it was a different experience for both of them. And so it was very clear how they supported Amit through this process, and in a way that was like you just don't see that often because it's not talked about. And so I think from the perspective of children, it's often, there's a fear of what's it going to do to the kids and how are they going to respond. And this is a beautiful showcase of the kids will be okay. They're, these kids were accepting and welcoming to their both their mothers because they saw they were being their true authentic self.
Sure. I mean, children are affected by all family dynamics. And I would argue that children seeing a parent able to own who they really are and live in that authenticity is an even better model, despite the challenges that they go through because of society's stigma of trans folks.
So, Jackie, what would you say if somebody were to bring up the point of why is a film like this so important right now or in general? Because why are we even talking about transgender folk? Why is this a conversation we should be having?
Sure. I mean, I will share that from a Keshe perspective. We want to work to make Jewish communities as strong and places of belonging as possible. And to do that, we have to be as welcoming of as many people as possible. Beyond welcoming, we have to make our community spaces of belonging. And unless we see stories of people unlike ourselves, we're not going to be able to even take those steps. So films like this help us see that there are people in Jewish community of all kinds. And I really like to lean into the Jewish value of everyone being created b'tselem Elohim, in the divine image. And to me, that means that it's not just all of us kind of living in this divine image, it's that every person is specific in their unique self. And that specificity and that uniqueness is divine. And so if we're going to be truly communities of all kinds of Jews, we need to be seeing ourselves in diversity. It's the very fact of diversity that makes us divine.
Beautiful. And I think, we mentioned a lot in the beginning about our own pronouns, and there's a clear conversation in the film about the use of pronouns and how you should call someone or refer to someone who has transitioned, not by their I don't know if everyone on the call will understand the dead name or a pronoun that they used to use but no longer identify with. And so can we discuss a little bit about what can someone do if they call someone the wrong pronoun? Or because I think that is a fear, if you don't know and you call someone she and they're not, that's like a fear of the person who's talking to a transgender person or a lesbian or someone who's gay. Just how do you approach that? How can you rectify calling someone the wrong pronoun without making that awkward?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So I'll first start by saying why it's important to share pronouns, and begin by saying that all people have pronouns, not just LGBTQ people. So, instead of saying Moishi is using Moishi's ingredients to make Moishi's challah for Moishi's grandmother, we say Moishi is using his ingredients, etc. So he, him, his would be that pronoun suite. And so we all have pronouns is the first thing. And we can't tell someone's pronouns just by looking at them, in the same way that we can't guess someone's gender just by looking at them. And gender does not tell us what pronouns someone uses, and pronouns don't tell us what gender someone is. So having that framework as a start is important. And so the importance of sharing your pronouns is to allow others to refer to you correctly. And it kind of challenges that assumption that we can guess what someone's pronouns are. And if you're a person whose pronouns are regularly respected by others, especially cisgender folks, sharing your pronouns takes the burden off of those whose pronouns are regularly disrespected. And so sometimes it will make mistakes. Mistakes happen. They're a natural part of life. But that doesn't mean that they can't cause hurt. So when we address them, it's important to minimize harm as much as possible. And the way to do that is to avoid explaining kind of how or why the mistake happens. You don't want to say, oh no, I'm so sorry. This is just so hard for me. Language is such a challenge. I know the other pronouns for you. None of that. Instead, you say, I'm sorry. Thank you. Correct the pronoun and move on. It just gives a grounding framework of apology, making the correction, thanking someone for giving you the gift of feedback, and then continuing. And if you find yourself making mistakes frequently, practicing the correct pronoun is so helpful. Saying like, oh no, I misgendered that person, giving them 3 compliments in your head with the correct pronoun can be a really helpful practice mechanism.
I think that's super helpful. I mean, in terms of lots of different communities, I think it's universal, right? Like if you make a mistake and you learn from that mistake and you try better next time to be better at it, then you're making progress. But I think that's really helpful. So I, like you, probably watched the film multiple times to kind of understand what was happening in the film and get to know the characters better, even though they're not characters, they're real people. But understand the individuals in the film and their story and experiences. And I'm just curious what, after seeing it so many times, how you felt watching that.
It's such a big question, so I'm going to take a minute just to gather my thoughts.
While you think, I can share like how I felt.
Please, yeah.
So the first time I watched the film, I was really, I think I was a little shocked because I don't know so many transgender people. And so I don't know I don't know the experience the way that the film showed it. And so that was, and I don't say shocked as like it was shocking, frightening, shocking. It was just shocking to like understand something I didn't know before and see it in a different way. And to get to understand Amit and all of her emotions throughout the entire film was really, it opened me up to understanding someone else's experience, obviously, but it also helped me to empathize with, the whole spectrum of emotions that go into being comfortable with who you are, anybody being comfortable with who they are. And then the second time I watched the film, I just was more, I think the relationships really spoke to me of like how everyone kind of like came together and lifted each other up and supported each other and figured out their own place in this whole dynamic of their family structure. Like that was really interesting to see the second time. But yeah, the film itself was beautifully made, and I think something I'd never seen before.
Yeah, I think the relationships were also something that really spoke to me. I was so moved by this family and the 4 children and their extended family. Their celebrations were something so beautiful, watching the youngest daughter's or second youngest daughter's bat mitzvah. What a beautiful simcha. Watching their wedding, even though it's bittersweet because we know now what's coming after, it's still a beautiful simcha, the symbolism of smashing the mask. And I think the main thing that sticks out to me beyond relationships is the kind of systemic challenges and barriers that many queer and trans folks face. So I'm thinking about being able to access healthcare. Like, yes, Amit and Galit were able to travel for surgery. And while they're in the hospital room, Galit mentions that many other people experiencing the same operation are there alone and don't have someone with them. And so they have a support network in a way that many other people don't. And even the ability to access that kind of care takes great financial resources. The flight across the world, the actual surgery, the time spent in the hospital recovering. And there are many barriers that folks in this country and national and internationally face to accessing that kind of gender affirming healthcare. And I think another system that they butt up against, which is something you mentioned earlier, is religious systems. There are so many religious communities of all denominations of Judaism who are welcoming of LGBTQ folks and others who are not. And we see an example of that when they're experiencing trying to get a get, trying to go through a divorce. And the Israeli rabbinic court is unable to think beyond the rigid binary. And there's we see a really painful misgendering of Amit. And that was incredibly heartbreaking to me. And so I think, and thinking about how those systems can be adjusted for full LGBTQ belonging is something that's really sticking with me.
I think also important to note is that the love never left. Galit still, like even after the experience at getting the get, Galit was talking to her mom and she was like, this was so painful for me. Like watching Amit go through that, it just the whole dynamic of their relationship, it wasn't like, okay, they decided they were gonna end it and that was it. Like this was a really tough decision for them. And it wasn't because of the fact that, that Amit transitioned the way she did. It had something to do with that, maybe. But their relationship really was so strong that after everything that they experienced, they still loved each other from what it from what it seemed like in the film. Obviously, we don't know because we can't speak to them right now, but it was a really powerful film of love for one another.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think that they mentioned at some point that they had been in a relationship since they were 15, which is many, many decades for folks who are still pretty young. And I think it is very possible to fall out of love with someone and still care about them. And I mean, even though we see that it's a pretty painful breakup, they're still able to show up as support for one another, to care for their kids, to stay in the same town, have other partners, bring in their extended family and community. And often that is what queer community can look like. It's kind of chosen family. Our friends become our family. Our partners and their extended friends, they kind of become our local community. So absolutely, I think there's so much love present in this film.
So one question was, it wasn't clear how much time had passed. And I also kind of was a little bit confused about that, because from the time that they were in Thailand to the time that they went through the process of getting a get to the end of the film, I don't remember how long they said it was. I don't know if it was a year. I don't remember like the time. And it did see, I mean, it did seem like it kind of was a process. It wasn't like, they got back from Thailand. It wasn't like a quick life altering process that happened. It took its time, and what it seemed. But I don't recall from the film how long that process was.
Right. The only time marker I remember was pretty close to the end of the film, after the divorce. And then it said 1 year later, and we see how everyone's doing. So I'm not sure. I can't really speak to the timestamps, but I'm imagining it wouldn't have been immediately home from surgery, wedding, divorce. Surely there would have been time in between those.
So before we wrap up, what would you like to share with the community who watched the film and listened to us, during this time? How can we be more inclusive to, everybody in our community, but be more responsive and more proactive instead of reactive to a situation? You know what I mean? Like, how can we be proactively inclusive rather than reactively inclusive, and realize, oh, we didn't do this, let's be better about this? How do we actively engage in our community to be more open and welcoming?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are many ways to do this. I think I'll focus on the representation piece because we're discussing this as part of a film festival. So we've seen a film about a family with a trans person, and I'm also interested in inviting folks to explore trans narratives created by trans people too. So there are a few examples that exist in the world. I'm thinking of Pose, which explores kind of ballroom culture in New York in the 1980s. And that series has a large cast of trans actors. I think it's the largest cast of trans actors in TV history, which is so exciting. There's also a character in the film Euphoria who's a teen, and the show deals with pretty heavy, complex storylines. And there's a trans character played by a trans actress, but the show doesn't really focus on her gender identity. It doesn't make it the entirety of the storyline. So adding to the stories that we see by making sure that we're kind of diversifying our viewing practices. So I think that's a really good first step, especially while pandemic continues and we're home a lot and online watching shows a lot. That is a great way to take some action. And if folks are interested in other means to kind of think about Jewish community through an LGBTQ lens, we have a number of resources on the website that I mentioned before. So there's one section in particular that says Jewish text and tradition through LGBTQ lens, which could be an interesting area for folks to dive into.
I'm definitely going to look into that. That sounds very interesting. Thank you, Jackie, and thank you everyone for joining this important conversation and watching this beautiful documentary. You can visit our website, and we'll post that in the chat for the links to the Kasha resources as well as our future programs. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you soon.